Thank you, everyone, for joining this urgent Verso discussion on the US and Israel's continuing illegal war on Iran. This war, as we all know, is the fulfillment of a long-held fantasy of a whole layer of the American and Israeli establishment that stretches across party lines. They're being backed by Canada, Britain, Australia, and Germany, among others. So this is not just the US, of course. And following Israel's playbook in Gaza, the US and Israel are targeting civilian buildings and neighborhoods, attacking unarmed vessels, and seem committed to razing Tehran, a city with a population of around 10 million people. They managed to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. But the Iranian regime so far shows little sign of imminent collapse. The main effects of this war have been the destabilization of strategic US alliances across the region and instigating a potential economic crisis across the globe. This is a moment of intense this is a moment of intense political crisis that is difficult to make sense of. Some of the key questions we're faced with are: what are the US and Israel's goals with this war? What is the future of the Islamic Republic, and what would its collapse mean for the regime? To think through these important questions and many more, I'm joined by four esteemed experts on Iran, one of whom I hope we will be seeing very shortly. But I just want to quickly introduce each of them. Um, and sorry, just give me one moment. So the first speaker is Afshin Matin-Asgari. He is a professor of Middle East history at California State University, Los Angeles, and the author of the just published book with Verso, Axis of Empire, A History of Iran-US Relations. We also have Golnar Nikpour, who is Associate Professor of Modern Iranian Political and Intellectual History at Dartmouth College. She focuses particularly on the history of law, incarceration, revolution, and rights, and is the author of The Incarcerated Modern: Prisons and Public Life in Iran. Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi is an assistant professor of international relations of the Middle East and at the University of St. Andrews. He is the author of Revolution and Its Discontents. And Professor Ervand Abrahamian is Distinguished Professor of Iranian and Middle Eastern History and Politics at Baruch College, CUNY. He is a historian of the Middle East and author of the forthcoming Iran 1979: An Inevitable Revolution, which Verso will be publishing in 2027. So we're really, really lucky to have all of them here today. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Afshin, who can start us off. Thanks so much, Afshin.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to all the participants. I have only 8 minutes, and maybe I can say a few things about the longer term background of this conflict between Iran and the US. Iran and US is in the title of the book, but I want to note that when we say Iran and the US, sometimes by those terms we mean the states, and because Iran means a lot more than just the Islamic Republic, and so does the US, more than the Trump administration. This is something I wanted to address in the book. I wish I could have written a people's history of Iran and interactions with the people of the US on a broader scale, but inevitably, unfortunately, things focus on state actors. But I've tried not to see like a state. And I want to, in this conversation, as much as we can, bring into the discussion the people of Iran as actors who are oftentimes victimized by, of course, by the war, but to acknowledge that the people of Iran for at least 2 generations have pushed back against the Islamic Republic. They're not one and the same thing. Of course, the regime has supporters. If we go back in history, much more. But I'm sure that we will talk also about the people of Iran in this background. So my quick outline would be going back to the beginning of the 47-year confrontation between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the U.S. A very outstanding event is the hostage crisis, 444 days. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran was being held hostage and its occupants by the fledgling Islamic Republic. I think we can talk more about this if people want. It was, I think, primarily um, an attempt at state consolidation. I think it cost heavily for Iran. It could be interpreted as an act of war, and so is the heavy sanctions that President Carter imposed on Iran, and the sanctions continued. It became clear, as it was more or less clear to observers, that these sanctions uh, are meant to hurt the people of Iran, and to the point that the people will rise up and maybe at some point topple the Islamic Republic. Something that really has not happened in any kind of sanctioned regime. It didn't happen in Cuba. It didn't happen in Iran. But that's what complicates the equation. That presumably they are aimed at the state to change its behavior or to topple it, but in essence, aimed at, it's a war against the people of Iran. I know people will talk more about the sanctions, so I'm going to stop there. So the sanctions are in the background. There were periods of ups and downs that maybe in the 1990s, after Ayatollah Khomeini died, there was a period of relative detente or de-escalation between Iran and the U.S. The sanctions were never removed. And then we have a period of their intensification after September 11, when something, a turning point with the Israel lobby and the Israeli government really took over the U.S. Policy towards Iran. And they focused on three things, three accusations. The Islamic Republic has a nuclear program which is using to build nuclear bombs. It has military presence outside of its borders. It's helping the Lebanese Hezbollah. It's supporting Palestinian resistance organizations. All of these are a threat to Israel, and Israel had to convince the U.S. that these are threats to the U.S. And the ballistic missile program that Iran developed. The nuclear issue was the focus of this. And I want to say that there, the Islamic Republic's policy of nuclear ambiguity, of assuring the U.S. and the world that its nuclear program was for peaceful purposes, but at times acting as if it was trying to have the capability of building a bomb, as it was saying will never do so. I don't think this policy served to de-escalate tensions, but we can talk about that. However, as we saw during the second term of Obama in 2015, there was something called the Obama deal. It was an agreement between Iran, U.S., other international main actors, and it allowed for a close monitoring of Iran's nuclear program in exchange for some kind of sanctions relief, not completely, but that deal showed that it was possible to de-escalate. Comes Donald Trump during his first administration. He threw out the deal and said, "It's bad. I'm going to force a better deal on Iran." Throw in a good measure. He started an assassination campaign, killed Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's forces, Quds Force, and um Biden, after Trump, maybe had a chance to maybe revive the deal. But again, Biden showed himself to be 100% supporting the Israeli agenda, including his genocide in Gaza. And so the deal was not renewed. And in 2024, 2025, Israel escalated its attacks on Iran, assassination of scientists, hitting the Iranian embassy consulate in Syria, and to the point that finally the Islamic Republic retaliated by sending missiles towards Israel, and Israel hit back. And that was a background for last June, the 12-day war between Israeli attack on Iran. Donald Trump joined in, heavy bombardment, and that was the point that brought us to the point we are today. The immediate background, I think I have about one more minute. I'm going to wrap this up. The immediate background was another uprising in Iran in early 2026, put down with extreme brutality, the loss of thousands of lives. This was part of a cycle of protests that we've seen in Iran. In the last years, they have escalated. If you count them, they happen almost every 10 years or so, but recently they've happened more and more. They were put down, and perhaps Netanyahu and Trump thought that this would be a good point to attack Iran. But obviously, as we see, an attack of this enormity must have taken months of preparation. It's not just something that could be done a spur of the moment. So I'm going to stop there, and we can come back and talk more about any of these points later on during our discussion.
Thank you so much, Afshin. Golnar, would you like to go?
Sure, happy to. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin just by thanking Verso, who has been such an important voice for so long, and thanking my esteemed co-panelists from whom I've learned so much, Afshin, Ervand, and Eskandar. And thank all of you for coming today in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon to hear from a few scholars about what is happening in Iran. I know that the goal of this event is to talk about Iran from a few different perspectives, and Afshin, Eskandar, and Ervand will be talking about some of the more recent history that has brought us to this point. What I wanted to do was think a little bit about the provocation posed by the title of the event, Can Iran Survive? And think about what that question really means, and at different scales of how we might ask and answer that question, both in the contemporary moment and thinking a little bit about a much longer view of history. I also want to just begin. I mean, I think it would be fairly obvious given Verso's longstanding political commitments and the sort of ethos of the people on the panel today. But I just want to state clearly at the top that I come from a perspective, the perspective I'll be providing is as a scholar who and a person, an activist who not only opposes this particular quite horrifying and catastrophic war, but indeed, on a more broad level, has long been thinking about and I have long believed and advocated against this type of kind of regime change war launched by the United States more broadly, right? So we have to always think and imagine the context of today in the broader context that we're operating in a post 9/11 world, and particularly with the occupations and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the state collapses that we've seen in those contexts. And indeed, it's precisely that set of circumstances that have sort of over these decades since I was a college student going to anti-war protests in 2003, 2004, 2005 to this current moment has sort of shaped the way I see U.S. involvement in the region, military involvement at the region. At the same time, I think it's important as people broadly who are thinking about these questions from the perspective of the left to think about what a principled left position might look like from within the context of the U.S., where we both oppose war, sanctions, imperial aggression, and think about what we might be able to say and analyze, given the Islamic Republic's own record of repression and political violence, to which Afshin alluded, right? So for me, it's important in a meeting like this for all of us to think together about what that sort of conversation might look like, what principled positions to that end might look like. And I'd like to suggest here that if we look at a much, much longer view of history, Iranian political movements over many, many decades, I mean, I'm talking about decades and even over a century, have actually had a kind of analytic framework to think about the context in which Iranian people have been sort of trapped in these generations. About this seeming quandary, right? The language emerges in the turn of the 20th century. So I promise I won't stay there very long, but I'm going to go to an early moment and say that beginning in that moment, Iranian political movements start imagining and placing their political analysis in such a way where they're attempting to counter what they call both despotism, estebdad, internal despotism, repression, authoritarianism, and the external pressures formed by imperialism, colonialism, estemar, right? So those words sound relatively similar in Persian, but the idea is that these political movements, really beginning at the turn of the 20th century, as I say, are attempting to think through the particular bind of being in a context that is not formally colonized, and indeed Iran is never formally colonized, but is nonetheless facing both a sort of moving target set of internal and external power brokers, sort of sets of power in which political movements attempt to then engage. And at different moments, different aspects of that sort of twin set of oppressors come to feel much, much more intensive, right? That the internal or the external will seem more intensive. And I think at this last week, we were at a moment, a high crisis of the external, right? Imperial warfare launched by the most powerful imperial power in human history, the most powerful military in human history, all pouring the weight of its military apparatus onto Iran. And yet we always have to keep these things into some sort of frame together, right? This is, in fact, our analytic duty. And analysis is always the core of action, right? We have to analyze the question of how we got here correctly in order to be able to think about what we need to do next. So we have this twin kind of structure between the internal despotism and external colonialism. That was the first point that I wanted to raise. And I wanted to raise the idea that it's not just that they exist, but that indeed they are working together. It's forms of power that are often linking in ways that are somewhat invisible. And I think sanctions would be a good place to think about how that works, right? The way in which the corruption of the Islamic Republic, paramilitaries and ruling elite, and a sanctions regime have equivalently or worked together to sort of immiserate ordinary people in a way that is, that you need all of that sort of analytic to get at. So let me again turn to the question at hand. Will Iran survive? Obviously, in the first place, it's very plain that first and foremost, many Iranians will not, and indeed already have not survived, right? We are already at a point where some 1,300 people have officially been killed. That's from the Iranian Deputy Health Minister, Ali Jafarian, including 200 children, 11 healthcare workers. And that number is almost certainly an undercount already. And who knows what today's total will be, tomorrow's, the next day's, the next day's. But we also know, again, I try to think both sort of longer frame historically into the past and also into the future. We all, even if the war were to stop today on a dime, immediately after I stop speaking, that wouldn't be the only sort of catastrophic loss of life. We have already seen, for instance, the skies over Tehran be covered in black smoke, pour down black rain after Israel bombed Iranian oil facilities. The scenes in Tehran, I think for those of us who watch them, were quite apocalyptic. For those of us who know the city, have walked around its streets, were particularly painful. And toxins spread across the city and its environs are extraordinarily carcinogenic. And we don't yet know who will die of cancers that have not yet metastasized. But we do have Iraq to guide us on that. We know that, for instance, the official numbers in Iraq are such that the incidence of cancer in the country was about 40 out of 100,000 people before 1991. And by just 2005, and these are almost certainly undercounts because of the sort of limited ways in which we could get at this data, That number has, within just 2 years of American occupation, becomes 1,600 out of 100,000 people. That's an extraordinary amount of death and suffering that isn't actually captured in civilian casualty counts, right? Because they're not the immediate effects of bombs dropping. I mean, they are the immediate effects of bombs dropping, but they take a longer timeline. So already there is something of Iran that won't survive. Each one of the people who lives there and who calls themselves Iranian or who is part of the fabric of Iranian social life is indeed a little world unto themselves. All of those people have already not survived. And yet, we know that we're asking at different scales than this, right? So in the first instance, it seems to me that the US and Israeli architects of this war are telling us, although they walk it back, then they push it forward again, then they walk it back, that the goal is regime change. Thus, the goal is for the Islamic Republic of Iran not to survive. Donald Trump has stated, amid the onslaught of violence, that he actually doesn't understand why the Iranians haven't capitulated already. He said this even before the war started, as a result of sanctions. He says, I don't understand, given the pain we've inflicted, why they don't capitulate. And he said this again this week. I don't understand why they won't capitulate, given the enormous military outlay and sort of catastrophic bombing campaign that we've inflicted over the course of a week. I don't understand why they won't capitulate. But it seems very clear to me, and this is something that Iran analysts have been saying for many years and decades, that it will not be easy to dislodge the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I believe it would be impossible to do so simply from the air, no matter how sort of cataclysmic or apocalyptic that violence becomes. It would be very difficult, if not outright impossible, and would thus require some level of so-called boots on the ground, which Trump has not seemed as inclined to go for yet, but is clearly in the conversation, right? From the Iranian point of view, they understand their asymmetrical limits, right? And what we have seen in the last week is that their strategy has been to try to grind the global economy to a halt and to hit US military targets across the Gulf and across the region, and to hit economic targets across the region. Iranian state TV 3 days ago was talking about the goal is to eliminate the idea of these Gulf states as a safe haven for capital and for the sorts of as a safe haven for capital, right? To try to take down these spaces of extraordinary wealth as a way to push the U.S. to feel enough pain to not engage in another bombing campaign. The Islamic Republic believes it can absorb an enormous amount of punishment, as long as it takes for it to convince the Americans and the Israelis not to launch another war of aggression. Now, of course, if it comes to this, we will see an enormous degree of suffering and loss of life. But the government sees this as an existential assault, not only on its own ability to maintain power, but on Iranian territorial and sovereign integrity. And it's speaking in those terms, maybe to bring people onto its side, but it clearly sees them in those terms as well. It is using the language of being Iranian, of defending the homeland, of defending Iran more broadly, not just the Islamic Republic. And to the extent that the Islamic Republic has a military force, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is perhaps the most powerful state institution in modern Iranian history. It feels that it can outlast its adversaries. It can't inflict more damage to them than damage it can take, but it feels that it can nonetheless outlast them. And I'll just briefly I'm almost done. I'll just kind of briefly say that from my point of view, here we see something of might be a divergence between what the Americans and the Israelis may want. Very plainly, from my point of view, the Israelis would be perfectly content with an Iran that sort of loses its territorial integrity or its sovereign ability to constitute itself as a coherent state. We all know, of course, that the Israelis in Gaza have long had a policy they call mowing the lawn, a phrase that was coined to describe Israel's routine bombings of Gaza. It could extend to Lebanon or Syria. That would be an effort to disallow organic and independent political institutions, military institutions to emerge and gain strength. As former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett put it, he who does not mow the grass mows him. That's the theory, right? That's what we're seeing. And so from that point of view, the collapse of Iran at a more broad scale would not be a problem. So when we come to that last scale, and this is my final point, can Iran survive at the level of territorial coherence and sovereign statehood at all? Well, everyone involved right now is playing a dangerous game, and even the Islamic Republic. I mean, it sees its defense that it's undertaking as the only possible way it can defend itself, and yet there are real questions about what will happen next once the devastation is done. We know that this broader territorial coherence and sovereign statehood is what is ultimately, to some extent, at stake. Donald Trump has just said that the map of Iran, and this is a quote, will probably not look the same once the war is over. This tracks with the position promoted by some in Israeli media and public life, that the best case scenario from the Israeli point of view would be an Iran carved into mini ethnic statelets, balkanized, as it were. Now, although this level of state disintegration is not at all imminent, at least yet, I mean, not a week in, it has long been the worry of the anti-war left, myself included, when it comes to the question of U.S. war in Iran. It doesn't take looking around very much to Iraq and elsewhere to see what may be in store. And I'd like to just end by pointing out that this is a long-standing, sort of undergirding issue for Iranian political life, one that has actually been shaped by the colonial encounter for not just 47 years, not just the 20th century, but indeed for some over 200 years, right? Precisely territorial integrity and the issue of carving up the country was a major concern of Iranians in the 19th century, who did indeed lose territory to the British and the Russians, and did indeed see the country carved into spheres of influence. And that memory is incredibly important in the contemporary Iranian imaginary, because the institutions of the state that are built under the Pahlavis in the 1920s and after, and expanded by the Islamic Republic, are in some sense in the 1920s and 30s a response to the fact that there is no strong central state in Iran in the early 20th century and 19th centuries, and as such, there's no way to repel colonial machinations, right? So I just want to end there with thinking about all of these different registers, the sort of level at which ordinary Iranians are harmed, the level at which the Islamic Republic may or may not survive, and the level at which Iranian sort of capacity to be sovereign and have a state at all is to some extent under threat in this war. So I'll end there, and I know others have a lot to say. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Golnar. Next, we're going to move to Eskandar. I just want to quickly say that although we don't have a public chat, we do have a Q&A box. So if you want to ask any questions, we will be taking participant questions towards the end. So feel free to add any questions there. Eskandar, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to Verso for organizing this event on such short notice. Obviously, very kind of honored to be here with fellow panelists, and yeah, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to be here to attend. The other thing I would like to say is just my unreserved, unqualified solidarity with the people of Iran in the face of this just naked imperialist aggression. Which is just devastating for all of us to watch and to be in touch with our loved ones and hear what they're going through and what they're dealing with. So yeah, I have a slightly more formal talk. We didn't really have a chance to coordinate what we would say, so I apologize if some of this has been said. But yeah, hopefully we can kind of open this up further during the Q&A. So yeah, the war we are witnessing did not begin in February 2026. It is the culmination of a long campaign of imperial violence directed against Iran. For decades, the United States and its allies have sought to constrain and weaken the Islamic Republic and more broadly Iranian society through sanctions, covert operations, sabotage, assassinations, and periodic military escalation. The strikes of 2026 therefore mark not the beginning of the conflict, but the point at which a long strategy of pressure, coercion, and imperial violence shifted into open war. Sanctions have been the central instrument of this strategy after the reimposition of US sanctions in 2018, following Donald Trump's withdrawal from the so-called Iran nuclear deal. Iranian oil exports collapsed from roughly 2.8 million barrels per day to around 300,000. Inflation surged over 40%. The currency lost much of its value, and large parts of Iranian society were pushed into economic insecurity. This was made possible by the United States' position at the center of the global financial system, what Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman have described as weaponized interdependence, allowing Washington to leverage its control over key financial networks to effectively cut Iran out of global banking and trade. The social consequences were very severe. Roughly 8 million Iranians fell out of the middle class, and poverty climbed to around 30% of the population. Sanctions therefore functioned not simply as diplomatic pressure, but as a form of economic warfare, reshaping Iranian society while deepening economic precarity for the working classes. But sanctions did not simply weaken the Iranian state. One of the paradoxes of prolonged economic warfare is that it often strengthens the coercive and survival capacities of states under siege. In Iran, the sanctions regime gradually reshaped the internal political economy towards institutions capable of operating under conditions of opacity. The RGC and other security institutions expanded their influence, not only in the security sphere, but across large segments of the economy. As formal economic channels were cut off, sanctions evasion networks, smuggling circuits, and black market economies proliferated. Access to these circuits tended to be concentrated among actors connected to the security apparatus and the state's parastatal networks. The result was a distorted political economy in which sanctions inadvertently strengthened the institutions most capable of operating under these very difficult conditions, and where the costs were borne overwhelmingly by ordinary citizens. At the same time, wages collapsed, inflation eroded purchasing power, and large segments of Iranian society were pushed into precarious forms of labor and informal economic activity. Sanctions thus restructured class relations inside the country. And of course, there was an interaction here with the sort of accumulation strategies pursued by the Islamic Republic's own ruling class, of course. This dynamic produced what some analysts describe as a form of asymmetric statehood. The Iranian state became highly capable in certain domains, particularly security, surveillance, and coercion, while becoming weaker in others, such as welfare provision, economic management, and social legitimacy. The state, therefore, did not simply shrink, its coercive capacities expanded while its social contract was eroded. None of this is to endorse the oppression of Iranian citizens or the brutal treatment of dissent that has characterized the Islamic Republic in its 47-year tenure. But the regime's political trajectory has been shaped not only by internal choices, but also by the structural effects of prolonged external siege. Policies of sanctions, encirclement, and siege have tended to strengthen precisely the institutions most invested in securitization, making certain outcomes more likely and increasingly path-dependent. Iran's broader strategic doctrine developed under conditions of extreme asymmetry. So after the Iran-Iraq war and the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, Iranian planners recognized they could not compete conventionally with the US. Instead, they developed an asymmetric form of deterrence, missile programs, regional alliances, and nuclear latency, designed not to defeat the United States militarily, but to raise the costs of attack and ensure regime survival. For nearly 2 decades, that strategy delayed direct confrontation, but the regional balance shifted dramatically after the 7th of October 2023, as Hezbollah suffered major losses, and the collapse of the Assad government undercut Iran's regional strategies, regional alliances, of course, which present their own really profound problems. The current war appears to have been launched on the assumption that decapitating the leadership would trigger regime collapse, or at least some sort of deal with the rump of the regime that was left. Yet the Islamic Republic has shown considerable institutional resilience. Revolutionary regimes forged in war and sustained through decades of siege often develop strong survival mechanisms, and the Islamic Republic is no exception in this regard. At the same time, the Trump administration appears to lack a coherent strategy or clear endgame. The rationale for the war has repeatedly shifted. So from regime change to Iran's missiles and the question of nuclear proliferation, none of these objectives can realistically be achieved through an air campaign alone. Israel's strategic logic is somewhat clearer. For decades, Israeli leaders have argued that Iran represents the principal obstacle to Israeli regional domination. From that perspective, regime change or even state failure could be seen as acceptable outcomes, and basically Israeli analysts pretty much admit to this very openly. Yet the war may produce the opposite of what its architects anticipated. Rather than collapse, the likely outcome may be further securitization of the Iranian political system. For some time, analysts have spoken about the possibility of Iran evolving into what is sometimes referred to as a Praetorian political order, in which the military security apparatus becomes the central actor. The assassination of Ali Khamenei may have accelerated that very trajectory. So in killing the supreme leader, the United States and Israel appear to have strengthened the very forces inside the Iranian system most closely tied to the security state. The succession of Mujtaba Khamenei, if he does survive or live to see many days and weeks ahead, illustrates this dynamic. Mujtaba had long been associated with the networks inside the IRGC and the wider security establishment, operating largely behind the scenes within his father's office. And of course, this is bigger than him, because I think any candidate that fulfills that role would face similar challenges. The circumstances of the war, and particularly the assassination of his father and members of his family, made his elevation far more likely, not less. In moments of existential crisis, political systems often gravitate towards figures who embody continuity, also, embody the core of what remains of its social base. With the existing order and possess strong ties to the security apparatus. At the same time, Mujtaba's authority will almost certainly be shaped by the balance of power, balance of forces inside the regime itself. The IRGC is now firmly in the driving seat of the war effort, and its institutional weight has only grown under decades of sanctions and conflict. The likely result is not regime collapse, but a more securitized political order, as I've said. For Iran's working classes and popular movements, this is not, of course, very encouraging. Reconstruction after the war will be extremely costly, and historically those burdens fall disproportionately on the working classes through austerity, declining wages, and worsening living conditions. The regime may also deepen its geopolitical pivot towards Russia and China as a strategy of economic and strategic survival. It is also important to be clear about something. Neither Trump nor Netanyahu are interested in democracy in Iran, let alone an Iran that empowers its popular classes. The United States and Israel have repeatedly shown themselves perfectly comfortable with authoritarian regimes, so long as those regimes align with their strategic interests. Opposing this war, therefore, does not mean endorsing the Iranian state. It means recognizing that external intervention and economic warfare rarely produce democratic outcomes, nor do they actually empower the working classes. More often, they actually strengthen the security institutions and entrench authoritarian rule. That is why it's important to connect opposition to this war with the broader anti-war politics that emerged. All the way back to the Iraq War when I was in university, as well as those which have emerged more recently around Palestine and basically fighting the genocide and protesting the genocide. Despite the repression that movement has faced in Britain and the United States, from protest restrictions and crackdowns, it demonstrated that millions of people are willing to challenge imperial violence, as well as its boomerang effect on the home front. The task now is to connect those struggles to a wider movement opposing war, sanctions, and imperial intervention, while supporting the right of Iranians themselves to determine their political future and struggle for a more democratic settlement. The lesson of the past 2 decades is clear. Imperial wars rarely produce democracy. They produce shattered societies, strengthen security states, and deepening authoritarianism, while allowing powerful leaders to destroy one state in the region after another with almost complete impunity. And in Iran, this latest round of imperial violence risks entrenching precisely the militarized political order it claims to oppose. So I would just like to emphasize, this very point that we can't actually let the Trump administration, we can't let Benjamin Netanyahu get away with this. It's sort of just one criminal endeavor after another. And this really has to stop, because, the reality of it is, if they succeed here, it's going to be one state after another, which they're going to basically pursue and destroy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eskandar. Ervand, would you like to go?
Yes. I'd like to talk about Iran's foreign policy. Um, the Islamic Republic is despicable. It's much more despicable than most people realize. But often the mistake is made that if a country's internal policies are despicable, then its external policies must also be despicable. Now, however despicable the Iranian regime is in its internal affairs, its foreign policy has been actually quite, I would say, rational, reasonable, even pragmatic. You can even call it opportunistic. After the hostage crisis, there have been a number of times when the regime, even when you've had conservative presidents, have reached out to actually normalize relations with United States. These have all failed. Just to give you a couple of examples, Khatami at one point openly said that Iran was willing to accept a two-state solution if the Palestinians accepted two-state solution. This was drowned out by, of course, demonstrations, rhetoric in the streets of debt to Israel, debt to United States. And people abroad preferred politically to take the rhetoric as its face value rather than pursue the actual olive branch, you could say, when the president talked about two-state solution. Even now, implicitly, Iran has accepted the Saudi proposal, which includes this two-state solution. But no one really wants to talk about that type of discussion. They much prefer to look at the regime as somehow obsessed with the end of the world, the return of the Mahdi, the end of time. And you hear on American TV so-called pundits saying that actually the Iranian regime is irrational. It doesn't think in a normal Western type of rational thought. What they're often doing is projecting their own base, which is the Christian fundamentalist base, which now they call itself evangelical base, onto, and they are obsessed about the end of the world and the return of Jesus. They project that type of rhetoric to the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime actually has been quite reasonable, I would say, and a number of times reached out to sort of normalize relations with the West. The West, on the other hand, has actually, or the West talking about United States, has since the hostage crisis outsourced its foreign policy to Israel. So nowadays when people talk about, well, what is Trump's real policy? He has so many contradictions. He has so many vague goals. The question is actually wrong. It's not a question about what he thinks. He has really outsourced, as other presidents have, the U.S. policy to Israel. You can see this in a number of ways. Usually a state will have some sort of institution that will develop state interests, state politics. The State Department really hasn't functioned for many years. At the present, there is no National Security Council to take basically information from the CIA, the Pentagon, to develop some sort of coherent U.S. policy towards Iran. So the result is that U.S. really has no policy. It really outsources it to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu has, I would say, maximalist goals in Iran. They talk about regime change, but I think people in Tel Aviv realize the idea of regime change is, of course, a euphemism for a military coup d'etat. That doesn't apply in Iran since the military are, in fact, the Revolutionary Guards. And what that would mean is actually the takeover of the Islamic Republic by a full-fledged Revolutionary Guards, which has partly happened actually with the killing of Khamenei. Because under Khamenei, he had a National Security Council where a number of people, besides the military, were there. People like diplomats, experienced diplomats, who had been constantly talking about a deal with United States over the nuclear issue. What has happened with his son taking over, and his son really was the representative of the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards have become actually much more powerful now than they were under the father's administration. So people who talked about regime change should have been careful what they actually wished for, because I think the situation is far more dangerous now than it was a week or 2 weeks ago. So the question becomes, what is Israel's really intentions, since they are basically making policy? You could say the United States is in the driver's seat. Iranians are just basically observers. And the driver's seats, the map is laid out by Netanyahu in Israel. Here, actually, it's interesting thing to keep in mind. Politicians in Iran also suffer from megalomania, hubris. They think that they are so important that they can influence American foreign policy. So, in fact, Ahmadinejad had a wonderful statement that sums this up. He says, I'm in the driver's seat as the president of Iran. I can drive faster, slower. I can even go backwards if I want. This actually ignores the fact that Iran is actually a minor state, weak state. US is in the driver's seat, and the map is laid out by Israel. So the question really becomes, what's Israel's policy? So they give a number of arguments. One is Iran is a dangerous power because of nuclear policy. Well, if that was so, why was Israel so adamant about the Obama deal? If one was concerned about Iran having nuclear weapons, that was a perfect actual deal. People who denounced it as basically the worst deal the US has made had not read the deal. If you look carefully at the deal, it's a very long document, but it's very precise. It actually says Iran can develop enriched uranium to 3.67%. It's limited to a very small amount under those restrictions, and also it was monitored. The UN, including American monitors, observed it to make sure that those limitations were not violated. So if one's concern was really about Iran's nuclear so-called aspirations, that was a good way of actually making sure you didn't have to worry. But Netanyahu actually flew to Washington in a panic to sabotage that deal, worked with the Republican opposition to sabotage, to oppose the deal. And of course, when Trump came in, one of the first things he did was to tear up the deal and wash it down the toilet. So that idea about Iran's ambitions about nuclear issue is more of a facade to scare people. Another argument that Israel often uses is that it's ballistic missiles. And of course, the other day, Trump said Iran had long-range ballistic missiles that would hit United States. This was very reminiscent of Bush claiming that Saddam Hussein had chemicals that he could destroy Manhattan at the drop of a hat if he wanted to. It was a way of scaring the American public into a panic, saying here is an imminent danger. Iran's missiles, of course, have showed in the June war that they really could not do much damage to Israel and basically protect Iran. So that's not an issue either. So the other idea about liberating the victims in Iran, again, I don't think anyone buys that argument since Israel has been involved in a genocide nearby in Gaza. So why would they be concerned about Iranians far abroad? So what one really is grappling with is what is Israel's strategy, since they are basically telling what is best for Trump, and Trump, this seems to listen to them. And this idea that somehow there is a gap between Trump and Israeli policy is, I think, misguided. There's no proof that there's somehow differences between them. They seem to have the same policy because Trump is basically taking the advice of Netanyahu on Iran. And again, I said this is a long-standing policy. It's not just Trump doing it. Previous presidents have done that. The only exception to this was Obama, when he actually then agreed to the deal, the nuclear deal. And that, of course, created a peace panic in Tel Aviv. And that's what prompted Netanyahu to come to the United States to sabotage the deal. But overall, since the hostage crisis, U.S. has really not had much knowledge about Iran, not many experts in Washington on the new Iran to give advice. In fact, one person under the recent administration, not the Trump administration, but just before that, who knew about Iran, they did a sort of Oppenheimer on him. They took away his security clearance in order to silence him. So there is actually no one in Washington in the administration who knows the slightest thing about Iran. So they basically have to rely on Israel for information, on knowledge. For instance, you can take the example, the last negotiations in Vienna. Who did Trump send? He sent a family member and a fellow real estate agent to deal with Iran. When Obama was dealing with Iran, he sent a whole basically host of experts, including nuclear experts, to monitor and get a discussion about the nuclear deal. So these I think claims of Israel about what they want is absurd. And the last absurdity is this idea of actually replacing the Islamic Republic with the potential pretender Shah. They basically are blowing up his importance as if he is a real contender. And they know perfectly well that that's not in the books. So what then becomes is the real intention of Israel. I propose the real intention is not actually regime change. It's not to disarm Iran. It's a much more maximalist intention. It is to dismember Iran, basically destroy the state. And from their point of view, if they can decapitate the state, even if they can't destroy the Islamic Republican guards, what they can do is cause enough damage at the center to weaken the state, and then they'll do what was done with other countries. They could pour arms into the country and incite basically ethnic divisions. And if you look at Israeli propaganda in the last 20 years, and among scholars in Israel, you find there's been a very unhealthy interest in ethnic issues in Iran. It's not just only the Kurdish issues. There are ethnic issues. Iran has a long history. There is a strong national identity, but there are also ethnic identities too. And we know from other experiences like Yugoslavia, even when you have a viable state, if you prod and know where to prod, you can create ethnic divisions. So their, I think, strategy, that not necessarily will succeed, but their strategy is, in fact, the destruction of the state of Israel, of Iran. From their point of view, one way of getting security for the future is basically destroy the Iranian state, break it up, or weaken it to the point that it'll become like other neighboring states, like you can say Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, so weakened that they don't have to worry about Iran in the future. And this is often, from their point of view, any outside threat basically helps the Palestinians. So for Netanyahu, the way to solve the Palestinian issue is to make sure there is no outside, even polemic or rhetorical support for the Palestinians. If you look back at the Iraqi thing, the Israeli view at that time, and the lobby in the United States constantly argued that the Palestinian issue would go away if there was no Saddam Hussein, as if Saddam Hussein was creating the Palestinian issue. Well, we know Saddam Hussein went, the Palestinian issue is there. Assad went, Palestinian issue is there. Even if Iran disappears, the Palestinian issue will still be there. But Netanyahu's perspective is this will be a great victory for him and for Israel if somehow Iran disappears from the political scene. So what I'm looking for or worried about is if there is sudden influx of arms into Iran. And of course, in Iran, there are plenty of reasons for discontent. As I said, the regime is despicable. People have genuine grievances. And if you pour arms into Iraq, as it was done actually with Syria, it's true Obama refused to use bombers in Israel against Saddam Hussein, but lo and behold, after Obama said he wouldn't intervene, there was a massive influx of arms into Syria. We don't know where from, but they were American arms, so it was probably done at the wink of the American government. And that arms led to basically disintegration of Syria for years. Much of the arms actually went to ISIS and basically became a major headache in the neighborhood. So Iran could very well fall into the same trap. I hope not, but that, I suspect, is the Israeli strategy. And so long as U.S. follows as outsourced its Iran policy to Israel, that I suspect is U.S. policy. So how much we talk about, oh, well, U.S. is separate, it has its own interests, it doesn't necessarily reflect Israeli interests. As long as we see no articulate development of American policies, and I don't see any of that, the U.S. interests or U.S. policy is basically parallel, reflective of Israeli policy, which is the destruction of the state of Iran. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Ervand, and everybody. This was a really interesting set of talks. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. I have a number of questions, but we also have quite a few questions from the audience. And I'd like to sort of pull some of those out because I think it would be useful. And I want to start with a question about actually the anti-war movement outside of Iran, because it's one of the questions that we posed. And I think that it's a real sort of pressing question for a lot of us who are not in Iran, who want to oppose this war. So we have one question that says that many Iranians who oppose the current war are grappling with this question in the context of the ongoing U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran and the broader question and the broader escalation. How can one maintain a balanced anti-war position while also acknowledging that the Iranian regime is repressive? Many Iranians oppose both external military intervention and internal authoritarianism. How do you overcome this sort of contradiction, especially with, imperialist violence ongoing? So,
anyone would like to take anyone?
Go ahead, Ezzy.
Thanks. I mean, I guess my general perspective on it is you have to kind of think about your location and where you are and where you're rooted and what you have the ability to change. So I've never been, I mean, on the one hand, we should never lapse into this sort of uncritical position vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic and then sort of try to present, whitewash its many misdeeds. And then try to kind of present it as kind of this embodiment of all that's good and representing kind of anti-imperialism and embodying that. I mean, I think that's obviously, and because my reasoning there is because the Islamic Republic doesn't really care what the Western left has to say about anything, and they're going to pursue their own objectives irregardless. But rooted as we are, based as we are in the West, it's our states, which are both sanctioning and immiserating Iranians. It's those states which are arming the likes of Israel. It's these states which have kind of a long track record of just abject criminality through, the invasion of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to actually do what we can to mobilize and restrain our own governments and use what limited means we have, and I guess while we still have them, some degrees of civil liberties, etc., which obviously are being eroded, systematically, and we see that both with respect to obviously climate activism as well as obviously the Palestine solidarity movement. But I think that's the way we need to kind of think about it. We're always obviously being mindful about not falling into this trap that we're going to kind of endorse the Islamic Republic. And we have to, like I said, we have to understand what it is we can and what we cannot change. And obviously, we have to show obviously solidarity with social movements that, which are within Iran and which are obviously mobilizing and protesting for, greater sort of democratic self-determination. And obviously, whether it's the Women Life Freedom Movement or workers' movements and those who are trying to actually, under very kind of forbidding conditions, trying to organize labor and sort of the proletariat more broadly, workers in essence. So we have to obviously show solidarity there while also kind of recognizing what we control. So that's the way I would orient towards it. I think that's generally a quite maybe a sort of a reasonable, calibrated way of approaching it.
Thanks, Eskandar. And a question that I had was about the sort of regional relations, because obviously at the moment Iran and perhaps Israel as well, sort of in false flag operations, is currently attacking, bombing US bases in the GCC. And a question that occurs is whether this war is likely to sort of loosen relations with strategic allies across the region for the US. What is the sort of outcome that you see from this kind of scenario? So I'll go to Ervand first, and then Golnar, do you also want to speak? Okay, actually, Golnar, do you want to go first? Because Ervand spoke more recently.
Sure, happy to. There's so many good questions in the Q&A, and just want to acknowledge that we probably just realistically won't get to all of them, but I do want to say a couple things to the question you just raised, Mia. One is that we have always to be thinking, whether we do this as a profession, as the four of us do, or as we're just sort of in the world, we have to be thinking at the analytical level and then also at the sort of practical level about what we can do politically. At the analytical level, we have to try to hold all of these truths, as Eskandar said, in terms of both the internal repressive structures of the Islamic Republic and the external pressures that it faces. But at the level of sort of organizing and practical organizing in the US or in Europe, the immediate task on our hands is building the power of any kind of anti-war left. There's an enormous amount of displeasure on the part of the American populace with this war. The most recent poll showed that only about in the high 30% or maybe about 40% of the U.S. right now is pro-war, and that's even before the economic shock hits. It's the lowest by far in the first week of a war that the U.S. has ever had in launching a war effort, right? So we already don't know at the practical level what new kinds of political synergies or solidarities might emerge in the context of Euro-American political organizing. But it's, to my mind, I always try to remind people that organizing isn't about sort of getting everyone to agree on all principles first and then acting, but rather trying to build organizational strength and show a coherent and unified anti-war movement while we continue to sort of hash out the debates and disagreements between us. So there's the analysis, which has to hold all of these things together, and the action that has to be sort of strategic about how it tries to move. At the geopolitical level, the question that you just raised, Mia, I think I feel the least certain about what might come next. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that right now we are seeing in real time how much more commitment the U.S. is showing to protecting Israel and Israeli interests than even its other long-standing allies. Just today, just a couple of hours ago, it was announced that the U.S. has requested and is getting from South Korea all of its THAAD batteries and machinery for the THAAD apparatuses that the Islamic Republic destroyed, which is going to leave South Korea in a very different type of military situation than it was in a week ago. And the GCC countries are seeing in real time the extent to which they are maybe going to be the biggest losers. Depending on how long this war lasts, you could make the argument that their economies, their security structures, the sort of tenuous security balance that they have managed to create, the presentation of their countries as stable, wealthy, and secure under the U.S. Under U.S. unipolar protection, that might take the biggest hit of all. And I don't know just what will come of a different world order, but we are seeing in real time allies, U.S. allies, and countries that have been essentially under U.S. protection see the hierarchy of how that protection is going to work, right? As Ervand said very plainly, U.S. policy towards Iran is being shaped decisively by Israel, which means that, that's going to leave other places in the lurch. Whether or not that opens up the possibility of new types of geopolitical cross-state action is not yet clear to me. But we are seeing a context in which already countries are announcing their intentions to pursue nuclearization. Even countries that are not particularly involved in this conflict, like Poland, announced that it's going to pursue nuclearization, because there's really no mistaking the lesson here, right? Who looks smart in the post 9/11 moment? It's North Korea. They got a nuclear weaponry and they're sitting pretty, as the U.S. demilitarizes South Korea today and leaves North Korea alone, right? So whether or not we're entering a new moment is not clear. Some people have compared it to the Suez crisis, wherein we, in retrospect, as historians can say, okay, this is a moment in which French and British imperial might is very plainly on the wane and U.S. imperial might on the rise. I don't see it quite like that. Because there's no one power that's coming in and showing itself to be sort of taking that mantle, at least not yet. But it's very clear to me that we're not going to leave this war in the same geopolitical situation that we have entered it.
Thanks so much, Golnar. Ervand, did you want to answer as well?
Yeah, about the question of the peace movement, I think it's European situation is very different from American. I think in Europe, the peace movement should very much stress the importance of basically rights within Iran, individual rights, and the despicability of the regime. The United States is different because here, United States, I'm a historian, so I'm familiar with there's some of the role of United States since World War II. There were 600,000 people were killed in Indonesia, all orchestrated by an army trained, armed, supplied by United States. 200,000 in Central America killed again, similarly, 30,000 in Chile, a million in Iraq. So for Americans and any movement in America to talk about America is at the vanguard of protecting human rights, individual rights, is so hypocritical and so basically disgusting. It should not be, the US should not be involved in trying to champion human rights. But I think the Europeans have enough distance from these disasters to be able to actually speak on behalf or support of Iranian citizens in Iran. It doesn't sound too hypocritical, for instance, for Sweden or Denmark to talk or to protest about what goes on, killings in Tehran. For someone like Trump to howl and say, he's a champion of protecting human individuals in the streets of Tehran, it's just sort of bad taste, leaves a bad taste in the mouth.
Thank you so much. And I suppose sort of linked to my previous question is what the like I guess I want to push a little bit. Like do you think that there is a possibility that alliances could be reconstituted, and how much of this is maybe like connected to Israel's war on Gaza in the last few years? I know that it's difficult to say, but of course there is a sort of like scenario in which you can imagine like allies sort of moving away from the US under pressure. I don't know. I suppose like a question related is do you see any potential for sort of grassroots uprisings in this moment if governments don't start to reduce their support for US alliances? Afshin?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I can't answer it, but I want to say that there is a premise to answering this question and other questions, and that is, uh, would the Islamic Republic fall in this war, or is it going to somehow survive? I think all the other questions somehow hinge on that outcome. Um, so without directly answering that question, I think if the regime falls, then it's totally unpredictable what would happen. Israel's main goal is going to be accomplished. Uh, if it doesn't fall, then first of all, I think I want to turn it back on the US. It's going to be a tremendous defeat for Donald Trump and his agenda of, he's already talking about invading Cuba. And if he is successful in Iran, there's no letting up on his kind of binge of going around and implement the Donroe Doctrine, go one country after another. So somehow, whatever we think of the Islamic Republic, despicable, we hate it, it's a dictatorship, if it manages to survive, of course, at the enormous cost burden on the people of Iran, it would be a major setback for US imperialist design and also for Israel. So I think that's something to be taken into account.
Eskandar?
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think if you even go back to 2019, following what appears to be an Iranian drone attack on oil installations in Saudi Arabia, and then the fact that the United States at that point similarly failed to provide a kind of a security pact and umbrella, which very much the kind of the Gulf states wanted. I think, that the Gulf since then or even before has been kind of hedging, and obviously they're still very much in the American fold, but you have seen a massive kind of shooting up in, for instance, Chinese investment in the Gulf. I mean, like sort of, I think upward of like 80 billion since 2019. I mean, it's really kind of, maybe even higher actually. So really eye-watering kind of figures. And also similarly, we saw in the Biden administration with Mohammed bin Salman how basically the Biden administration was completely incapable, despite all of these campaign promises, to really bring them to heel. But at the same time, I mean, I think this Iran war really highlights the degree to which we really see neo-colonialism at work. I mean, what we're really seeing is a archipelago of bases throughout the region, radar systems, all basically used in order to, as a kind of a staging ground or a forward kind of jumping off point for the Americans, a projection of power. But I do think, I mean, there are interesting murmurings even within the UAE, which of course is, Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, was quoted as saying that there is nothing that Mohammed bin Zayed hasn't done that we have asked of him. So I mean, even there, it is coming under strain, and I think this is obviously what other panelists have kind of highlighted, what Afshin and Golnar and Ervand have highlighted is, I mean, one of the things that really came out is the degree to which, since the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group was like basically deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean to really defend Israel, and not so much, far less so, the Gulf states. So I mean, we have to be realistic and not sort of think this is going to be some massive rupture simply because these elites cannot. I mean, they can't afford to. They owe too much of their own security and kind of preservation to American and increasingly kind of Israeli like technology and so on. But I do think that is coming under strain, and it is kind of unprecedented actually. And how it will actually cash out is yet to be seen. But I do think it is a kind of a watershed moment, and the fact that Israeli propaganda has been so proactive actually in trying to even sort of give this impression that the UAE or Saudi have already joined the war in Iran. And again, very much like the United States, has come into this, they're very much trying to drag the Gulf in, because obviously, Israel is the prime beneficiary of like instability and chaos in the region here, whereas the Gulf states understand that any kind of war, and similarly, Kurdish forces understood this as well, and this is why so far they were able to, in the KRG, were able to withstand American pressure. I think everybody in the region at this point understands that the real agent of chaos is Israel, and they're the ones who really are the only ones who sort of will gain from this and deepening this and prolonging this conflict. And I think that also explains the Iranian strategy as well, of basically rebuffing negotiations. Because I think one thing I just would like to add, which is on a separate note, I mean, the Trump administration, obviously there are like continuities with like the history of American imperialism, but I think, we're talking about the crisis of the rules-based international order, whatever that meant. And I don't really think that was ever really a coherent idea. Of course, it was more often than not a kind of a sort of a mask for liberal imperialism. But I do think, the fact that the Trump administration has actually weaponized negotiations on repeated occasions, and has actually used negotiations twice now as in many ways a way of sort of a means of them pursuing like outright wars on Iran. So obviously the June war negotiations were meant to follow like in the next days in Oman. Similarly here, in this instance, negotiations were very much ongoing, and to the point where the Omani foreign minister understood what was coming, and basically had this moment on Face the Nation where he was sort of saying that Iran is absolutely willing to not keep any enriched uranium on its soil whatsoever. And I think this was a way of him sort of, desperately trying to signal to the Americans that, this isn't inevitable. But it seems, the decision was made previously. And I think this really also just comes through in subsequent reporting on the June war. I mean, at the time, I kind of speculated that this was very, they were working very much, the Americans and the Israelis were very much working hand in glove. And we didn't know that for sure. It seemed that was very plausible. And, as subsequent reporting has shown, they were absolutely working hand in glove on this. And it was very much, like I said, the weaponization of like diplomacy. So I think, it's actually going to be really hard to see how we actually come out of this. and how any kind of trust could ever be established, even to kind of pursue a diplomatic track again.
Thanks very much, Eskandar. We are coming up on an hour and a half, so I want to give everybody, if there's anything else that you want to say, to a chance to give some final comments before we end the event. Yes, Ervand?
Yeah, going to a question of realignment. I mean, I think what this is going to do is accelerate the division between Europe and United States. I think this was already there. I mean, Greenland, other issues, but even Iran before was an issue because Europe was much more willing to negotiate and come to a deal with Iran, and was the United States pressured by Israel not to. And I think this war is going to, as it bogs down and becomes more intense, the Europeans have a clear incentive basically to distance themselves as much as they can from the United States.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to say anything before we finish? Afshin?
I just wanted to say that, and I see this relates to some of the questions that I see in the chat box, that we need to pay more attention to the voice of the Iranian people coming out of Iran. True, at this moment, the internet is cut and we can't have direct, immediate reactions. And the direct, immediate reactions may not be that accurate. We need some time for reflection. But if we step back and look at the past 10, 20, 30 years, yes, the people of Iran have spoken, not just through uprisings, which have come at moments of desperation. But if you look at the voices of Iranian civil society, labor unions, teachers unions, lawyers, attorneys, artists, ordinary people, it seems that the consensus has been they want some kind of a regime change accomplished internally and peacefully. They've tried many, many times to do this within the confines of the Islamic Republic, and the state has resisted this. The voice outside of Iran, at least for now, seems to be the voice of the monarchists, which is really the voice that is amplified by Israel. And I think that voice in time, as the enormous toll of this war on the people of Iran and its inability to accomplish anything positive has become more apparent, that voice is going to become at least less kind of aggressive, and we can go back and listen to these voices that are coming outside of Iran itself. It won't be easy at this moment of crisis, but it is not as if the people who live in Iran have been silenced, and we should listen to their voice.
Thanks, Afshin. Golnar, do you want to close any remarks?
Yeah, again, I want to apologize to all the questions we didn't get to. And I want to say something, this has been a moment of grave sadness for many of us who are Iranian or in the Iranian diaspora, or who simply care about human life. It's a pessimistic time, a griefful time, and a difficult one. And what keeps me optimistic, what keeps me thinking in ways that are opposed to the sort of current logic of death and destruction and despair and genocide across our region, is looking at Iranian political movements through many, many decades in general. There have been, the first sort of mass movements in Iranian history demanding a kind of democratic change in the country, anti-colonial and democratic change in the country happened in the 1890s. And every decade that those movements have renewed, they haven't always looked the same. Their targets have been different, but movements keep getting up off the mat and continuing to fight and struggle. And as Afshin just said, in the last 47 years, that includes women's movements, labor movements, et cetera. In the U.S. context, I think it's incumbent on us to think firstly and most directly about using any institutions that we have, whatever institutional power that we have on the left, such as it is, towards direct, principled, clear anti-war position. Anti-war in Iran, anti-war in Cuba, in Venezuela, I mean, all of these places that the U.S. is attempting to sort of transform along its Don Roma doctrines lines, right? And I think, again, we don't have to agree on all of the particulars, but there is this basic fundamental principle of understanding that democratic change, transformative change does not come at the barrel of a gun. It doesn't come from bombs falling overhead. Those types of things circumscribe people's opportunities, people's chances for making positive changes in their own lives. So yeah, I think the way that I think about answering, in some ways, the question that comes up again and again in the questions is how we do multiple things at once. And I think we do it by sort of foregrounding the fact that Iranian political movements have tried to do those things in sort of again and again, tried to pick up the pieces from having had devastating losses. And in this country, we saw in the last 2 years that the movement that seemed to scare the sort of powers that be the most dramatically was the student movement, the anti-genocide student movement across our campuses. My own campus sent riot police and hundreds of armed riot police onto its campus to break people's arms and arrest hundreds of kids and all that. And, you know, like they say, a hit dog hollers. And that is clearly the point. If it is the case, which we've all essentially agreed on, that Israeli demands are sort of driving the sort of policy positions of the U.S. vis-a-vis Iran, I think it's incumbent on us to understand that Iranian freedom isn't a singular thing that can happen without the rest of the region achieving that freedom as well. There's been a lot of chauvinism in the Iranian diaspora, a lot of outright racism, anti-Arab racism, anti-Iraqi racism, anti-Palestinian racism, people carrying Israeli flags. It makes no sense. Those are the forces, the Israel and the United States are the forces that have made the region so difficult for democratic movements in the last several decades, and we need to keep our eyes on that.
Thanks, Golnar. Ervand, did you want to?
Yeah, just a point. A new poll came out this morning, actually, which is interesting. The press in America has been representing the Iranian diaspora in the United States as fully behind the war, supporting Trump. Actually, the Gallup poll shows actually the diaspora here is very sharply divided. Some 50% actually oppose the war. And this poll was taken actually right at the beginning of the war, before some of the mass killings that occurred, especially in the girls' school. So in a few weeks' time, I think if a new poll is taken among the diaspora, you'll have a dramatic shift against the war. So even the diaspora, you would expect here, most of the refugees from the revolution, they have reasons to hate the Republic. Many of them are monarchists and had good lives in the old regime. Even there is a great deal of opposition on this attack on Iran.
Can I just say I would like to just say one thing, if that's all right. So when I was talking, I spoke a lot about how obviously this imperialist war damages and inhibits sort of the freedom of movement and action for like popular classes inside Iran. I think that's like obviously a given. But obviously it also comes back the other way. And I think the more the sort of the sooner we understand that these constant kind of wars also do come back and haunt us in all sorts of ways, whether it's in the US through militarization of the police, or whether it's actually the clamping down on various anti-war movements, environmental movements, Palestine solidarity, and so on and so forth. We have to really understand that it goes both ways. And we have to really take that, I think, that responsibility really, really seriously, because, like, as I said, I mean, if they get away with what they've done in Palestine, if there's never accountability, it's only actually going to get far, far worse. And, and eventually we're going to also be paying the price here very clearly. And we already are. I mean, you just have to look at like Minnesota. But I mean, I think that's going to be nothing by comparison to what eventually we might have to face.
I think that that's a very good note, if not depressing, to end on. But yes, hopefully motivating. Thank you so much, Ervand, Eskandar, Golnar, and Afshin, for this incredibly fruitful discussion. And it was really great to hear from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your hard work.